Today we're going to be discussing the advancements of composers in the classical era and how they influenced classical music and what exactly drew and wooed all of these masses. First, what you're probably asking is, what exactly was the classical era? Well, the classical era was birthed from the Baroque era. It lasted from about 1750 to 1830, and it was categorized by music styles such as symphonies, concertos, and sonatas. Jonna, what the heck are symphonies, concertos, and sonatas? Well, I'm going to go into that. Sonatas are multi-movement works that are primarily for a solo instrument and a piano, or just a piano by itself. And they're usually based in one key. So it will start in this key, it will go on, and then it will eventually end in this key. And it's composed of 3 movements. It's going to have fast, slow, and then fast. For a symphony, these are large multi-movement works that incorporate an orchestra, which contains 4 of the main groups of instruments. You've got brass, you've got winds, you've got strings, and you've got percussion. Symphonies usually never contain a choir unless you're Beethoven, which he included a choir in his Symphony No. 9 in 1824. This choir actually influenced other composers in the Romantic era and near the end of the classical era to also incorporate choirs into their symphonies, such as Mahler's No. 8 symphony. A concerto is a work of instruments. It's usually going to have a soloist player or a group of soloists who are way better than the rest of the group. Now, normally concertos are for piano and violin soloists, but of course that is not limited to that. So now that you have an idea of some common types of musical constructions in the classical era, I'm going to go into individual composers who influenced this era and continue to influence our lives today. So first composer I would love to talk about, and the very first one who came up on the scene, he was actually a Baroque composer that led into the classical era, and it is Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach was born into a family of composers. His father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, was a well-known German composer, and along with his uncles, everyone in that family was a musician of some sort, well recognized in Germany. Bach was the youngest of 8 children, so his parents died when he was around 8 or 9, and this of course caused him to move in with his older brother, Johann Christoph Bach, who was also a well-known German composer. Shocker! When Bach was 15, he enrolled in a school called St. Michael's, which is where he had access to not just music in Germany, but music in France, music in Italy, music in England, and etc. This helped form his ability in music and be able to do what other composers couldn't up until this point. Because of his experience in St. Michael's and how well he did, he had access to many jobs to which he would walk to. Yeah, Bach would walk 235 miles to his job in Leipzig, which was insane. Wow. In the later part of his life, he got a job at St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, Germany, where he would have to compose weekly cantatas for the church service. Now, cantatas are not small pieces whatsoever. It's multi-movement works that span around 20 to 30 minutes long, and he was doing this every week. And by the end of his life, he actually composed over 300 cantatas. But he wasn't the first candidate for this job at St. Thomas Church at all. Actually, the first candidate was George Philip Telemann, who declined the job. So, of course, Bach was the next one in line. So, you're probably asking, why the heck did Bach not get accepted first? Well, you see, Bach had a little temper issue. So just like a funny little quirky story about Bach, during practice at St. Thomas's Church, the organist misplayed a note, and Bach got so angry at him that he took his wig off and threw it at this organist and yelled, "You ought to have been a cobbler." Which, okay sis, you didn't have to read me like that, but okay. Also, did I mention he spent a month in jail? Bach didn't take well to the dismissal of one of his jobs and was thrown in jail for an entire month. Bach was a little temperamental. Bach's works would influence some of the classical era's greatest composers, and one of these composers being Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was a prodigy from the start, and his father, Leopold, noticed this. So what Leopold did was he didn't want his son's talents to go to waste, so he was working for the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg at the time, so he convinced the prince to let him go around Europe to have his son perform. The prince graciously let him do this, and the rest is history. They went town to town, city to city, and became more well known. In the papers, this boy was a prodigy. People couldn't believe it. Of course, this did come with a price though, because the harsh winters almost killed their family, and Mozart actually developed rheumatoid arthritis. I'm going to insert an x-ray here so you can see, like, ugh, it just freaks me out. So he wasn't the only prodigy in the family. Mozart's sister, Maria Anna Mozart, she was commonly referred to as Nannerl. She was also a prodigy, but was kind of left in the dark when it came to Mozart's genius, and Leopold made Mozart the shining light of his life. Poor Nannerl, we love you, sis. So Leopold was a huge driving force for Mozart's playing, and not necessarily in the best ways. When Mozart was 18, he wanted to leave the house and go traveling, but Leopold didn't want him to go by himself, so he sent his mom and had her kind of spy on him, and he fell in love with a woman named Mademoiselle Aloysia Weber, who was a 16-year-old soprano. Once he wrote a letter back to his father Leopold that he had fallen in love, Leopold was absolutely anger-stricken. He was so mad, and this was the beginning of the downfall of Mozart's and Leopold's relationship, and you can definitely hear it in Mozart's music, especially when Mozart's mother had passed on the journey. And Leopold blamed Mozart for this. And this was absolutely when their relationship took a turn for the worse, and this is when Mozart composed Piano Sonata in A minor. Now, I want to visit multiple aspects of this. During this time, composers would stay away from minor keys because they sounded imperfect. They sounded unstable. Specifically A minor, which has a dark ambiance to it. Another thing to mention is the immense contrast within the piece. So you have pianissimo versus fortissimo, which is very soft versus very loud. And a lot of composers didn't dare to do this because that just made things even more unstable in the music. And also, another thing with this piece is that it ends abruptly. I think that also symbolizes Mozart unable to find closure. Overall, Mozart's experiences and emotions he expressed through music. And you can definitely tell from the very beginnings of his work all throughout his life to the very end, it reflects the moment going on in his life. Now, of course, it's a domino effect, so we have Mozart, and Mozart inspired one of the greatest composers of all time, and that is Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was born in 1770 in a very unstable household. His mother was not only an alcoholic, but his father was an alcoholic. But his father was an abusive, raging alcoholic that when he would go out to bars, get drunk, come home, and force Beethoven to play for him. And every single time Beethoven got a note wrong, he would beat him. Why did his father make him play like that? Why did his father push Beethoven so harshly? Beethoven's father had read that Mozart's father, Leopold, was traveling around Europe, and Beethoven's father wanted to cash in on this and do the same thing. He saw that Beethoven could be a potential next Mozart. Despite the abuse, despite what his father wanted, Beethoven was actually a genius. He had an entire piece of Bach's memorized by the age of 8. Beethoven received enough money in 1787 to travel to Vienna, which was the music capital of the world during the classical era. And not only was it a place for him to be able to share his music and make a name of himself, but it was also where his hero was, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Beethoven dreamed of playing for Mozart, and he ended up actually getting to, and Mozart fell in love with him, said, "You are amazing. You are the next upcoming star." However, Beethoven had to leave early because he got a letter saying that his mother had tuberculosis and was very sick. So he had to go back home to Bonn, Germany, and take care of his mother who was dying. And once she died, then he had to take on the responsibility of his drunk father and his brothers, which was a huge toll on an 18-year-old boy at the time. He was 18. The anger and the resentment he had for his father during this time, having to take care of him and missing the opportunity of working with Mozart himself, would definitely transpire in the years to come through his music and his famous attitude. He had this massive God complex, a huge ego that he was famous for. An example of this would be he would receive a lot of patrons for his music, and one of the patrons was Count Lichnowsky, and they had gotten into an argument. They were bickering, pissed Beethoven off. Beethoven was very easy to piss off, by the way. He had very sensitive, fragile nerves. But Beethoven stormed out of the Count's estate and left a letter that said, "There are many Count Lichnowskis, but there's only one Beethoven," which honestly is the sentiment of Beethoven's life and how he lived. But because he saw himself as equal to noblemen, but really didn't have a name that was equal to that of a nobleman, he would fall in love with really rich, high-status women. And they, of course, would break his heart because they couldn't marry him. He had no name. He wasn't actually a nobleman like he tried to portray himself as. And one of these women was Josephine von Brunswick. She ended their relationship because, she couldn't marry someone who wasn't of high status. It came out that Josephina actually had a child who was mysteriously a music prodigy and kind of resembled Beethoven. You heard that right. T! Even though it was speculated to be his child, and probably definitely was, he didn't have children. He really, really, really wanted to be the father that he never had. So he did something that would ruin his reputation, and that was try to gain custody of his nephew. Beethoven's brother had died, and the only one left was, of course, his sister-in-law, or his brother's wife, who was the mother of the nephew. This was also around the time that Beethoven was losing his hearing. Anyway, he was dealing with the struggle of losing his hearing. He was upset that he couldn't bear any children because all the women in his life wouldn't marry him, wouldn't want to start a family with him. So he tried to take his own nephew, who belonged to his sister-in-law, rightfully. And he won, unfortunately. I mean, you can't just take someone's child away from them for your own selfish gain, Let's just say in the end it was a very tough hearing. His nephew Karl ended up resenting Beethoven for taking him away from his mother, and when Karl turned 18, he tried to commit suicide, which is something Beethoven knew very well because Beethoven also wanted to commit suicide when he was losing his hearing, and he moved out to nature to try to cure himself, but it just wasn't working. This changed him and his music forever. So he was depressed. Karl was actually given back to his mother after he tried to commit suicide. So he started going around the streets dressed up like a hobo, or he would dress in really nice clothes, but he'd wear them for days. There'd be food stains all over his clothes, and people would make fun of him, would yell at him. He'd be thrown in jail, and he would say, "I'm Beethoven," and people would say, "Okay, pal, sure, you're Beethoven." Who would have thought that the end of his life would he create the best symphonies, especially Symphony No. 9, which is the last symphony that he ever actually got to create. He started working on Symphony No. 10, but he ended up dying before he could finish it. Anyway, Beethoven had a huge influence, a huge impact on the classical era and composers who would soon lead the Romantic era. So how do these composers influence today? Well, just to give you a couple of examples, Bach's music is actually used in Nintendo video games. Mozart's music is played in classic films such as Eyes Wide Shut, Alien, and many others. There's a couple things about Beethoven's music that I think is really cool. Beethoven's music is played on the satellite that orbits the Earth, and Beethoven's music was also playing when the Berlin Wall came down and everyone from the East was traveling over to the West. Even though they're gone, they're dead, there's actually no living descendants of any of these composers I mentioned today. I think these composers prove that immortality definitely exists. And they do it through music, and it lives on, contributing to definitely the human tapestry. So, anyway, I hope you all enjoyed learning about the classical era today. Hope you learned a lot.